Legend of Total War here, and today we're doing another tier list using Tier Maker. This time I'm going to be rating every single race's unit roster against one another in this tier list here. So the best unit rosters will end up in S tier, and the unit rosters that I think are not quite as good will end up in D tier. But it's also important to note that every single unit roster in this game is definitely competent to handle legendary difficulty, but some unit rosters I think are just better than others. And I'll go through my reasoning as to why they are good or bad. Anyway, before we get into the tier list itself, I do need to let you guys know that this video here is sponsored by Manscaped. You guys know I've been with Manscaped for ages. Love the product, love working with them. Today I'm talking about the Beard and Balls bundle, which comes with the Lawnmower 5.0 and the Beard Hedge Trimmer. The Lawnmower 5.0 is your all-purpose electric razor. You can shave your balls, your chin, or your head and walk out of it without a scratch. The Beard Hedge Trimmer allows you to shape and maintain a longer beard instead of just going raw. Whether you're looking to get it done quick or take pride in your facial hair, it's never been easier to deal with body hair than with Manscaped. Check out the link in the description or pinned comment and get 20% off plus free international shipping. Big thanks to Manscaped for sponsoring this video. Okay, with that being said, let's get into the tier list itself. Now, whenever we do a tier list, it's really important to set down criteria. If I start just putting these in their ranking without putting any context in, I think that is completely unhelpful whatsoever. Because even if you disagree with where I'm going to place any of these, which is totally fine, you're never going to get 100% consensus with these kind of things. I just hope that you understand why I'm putting it in S tier or D tier, and it at least makes sense from my perspective, because I can only come at this from my perspective. Also, these tier lists are always campaign focused. They're got nothing to do with multiplayer whatsoever. So it's just important if you disagree with anything because you think, but this unit's really good in multiplayer. I'm not arguing that point. So it's just pointless to mention it. Also, every single one of these rosters has at least one unit that is capable of making a doom stack to basically trivialize battles. So ranking an entire race's roster based on one unit is also unhelpful because none of these races are simply able to just recruit those units straight from turn one and then just go and destroy everyone on the map. Nobody is able to do that. You in all cases will require to recruit the early stage game units at least. In many cases you are able to skip the mid game units, but I will be ranking them as well. So the rosters that end up in S tier will be ones that are strong in the early game, and the early game units are able to be competent well into the mid game or even late game, have strong mid game units, strong late game units, but are also able to get to their late game units quicker than some of the others. The ones that'll end up in D tier are factions that might have kind of weak units in the early stage of the campaign, where it's kind of a really important rush to sort of level up their settlements to get to their better units because their lower tier units are just not reliable. They maybe just rely very heavily on other campaign gimmicks, such as their legendary lords' abilities or their particular faction traits, where they rely on their lords and heroes too heavily, as opposed to just having solid units that can go up against an army that's bigger and stronger than it, and a competent player can overcome it because the units themselves are quite good. And the ones in D tier will be the ones that basically, if you go up against an enemy that is even slightly stronger than you particularly in the early game, you're probably going to have a really hard time and suffer massive casualties. Okay, so let's get into it, and let's start with Reichland. So we'll start with the Empire. So the Empire, I think, is a B tier unit roster overall. In terms of the early game, they don't have particularly great units. Not the worst units in the game, but they've got Spearmen at tier 0. So this is what you can recruit from a barracks. And that's really important what units you can recruit without requiring a barracks, because when you've only got one additional build slot, in every single case in this game, it's better to build an economy building so that you can get more units and pump out more armies, as opposed to unlocking a unit that costs more in upkeep and also is only marginally better. That's usually not ideal. You usually wait until your second or third build slot before you do that. So when it comes to the Empire, they've got access to basic spearmen and archers if you have the DLC. If you don't have the DLC, then that you basically are required to basically get the barracks as early as possible. So they do require a DLC in order to have good early game units. But also the thing is with the Empire, they are a very strong race, but not necessarily because of their roster. They've definitely got some really good units. Like I said, every single roster has got some really good units, and every single roster is competent in the campaign. But relying entirely on their unit roster is kind of foolhardy, because every single one of the Empire Legendary Lords have got a fairly powerful campaign mechanic, such as Karl Franz's Imperial Machinations, where he basically has cheat codes using prestige as a resource. Or you got Balthazar Gelt, who basically doesn't even need to use his rosters beyond turn 30, because you can just spam out wizards and incredibly powerful single entity doom stacks super early on. And so these factions here don't necessarily need to rely on having really good early game units. That being said, the Empire really shines with their unit roster in the late stages of the campaign. So when they get to their steam tanks, their Hellblaster volley guns, Hellstorm rocket batteries, their high tier cavalry, if that's what you want to choose, their high tier infantry, the high tier guns, that's where the Empire really becomes a good roster. And their growth rate is kind of pretty average. So that's where I'm going to put it there. It's sort of like the baseline of an average unit roster for this game. Now, a good comparison to the Empire is comparing them with the Dwarfs. The Dwarfs, I'm going to put them at S tier, because the Dwarves basically don't have any bad units, bar one, and that being their basic miners. This is the miners that you can only recruit. Well, that's the only unit that's recruitable from a tier 0 building. They used to have, well, very briefly, were able to recruit Dwarf Warriors, but CA thought that was too overpowered and took it away from them. That being said, for the Dwarves, it is actually fairly high priority to build a barracks very early on, and build some of their more advanced military buildings early on, because they have the vast majority of their best units available before, as of tier 3. So you've got gyrocopters available at tier 2, which that building can be built in a miner settlement. It's not too slow for them to grow anymore, thanks to the Age of Reckoning. Of course, if you don't do the Age of Reckoning stuff, then you're not going to grow. So it's really important that you get that 100% on that first round, so you get that extra growth in public order, especially if you're playing a legendary difficulty. But yeah, the Dwarves have really solid early game units because they have extremely high armor, extremely high leadership, so they're very reliable units in the early stages of the game. They're very powerful in auto resolve. They've got access to early game artillery that's very helpful, and as they progress through the campaign and start getting better and better units, well, then their army just gets better and better anyway. The Dwarves don't rely on gimmicks. They don't need powerful bombardment spells, army abilities. They don't need their legendary lords to be one-man doom stacks. Because their roster is reliable on their own. That being said, they do have access to one-man doomstacks. It's just that their roster doesn't rely on it. And of course, they've got one of the best units in the entire game, which is the Thunder Barge, although that's so late in the campaign that you start getting them, that by the time you get them, honestly, the Dwarf campaign should be basically won by that point. The Dwarfs are quite a powerful faction now. So I'm going to put the Dwarfs in S tier, because they've got a reliable unit roster all the way through the campaign. Okay, then let's talk about the Vampire Counts. So Vampire Counts, their unit roster, I'm putting them in C tier, okay? Because I personally think that the Vampire Count unit roster is kind of crap. Now, the Vampire Counts themselves are powerful factions. The thing is, with a Vampire Count army, the best units in their army are always going to be their lords and heroes, their spellcasters. Those are not their units. But that being said as well, they do have access to really good units. It's just that you either need to create a huge corpse pile in order to get those units early on, or you've got to pay quite a lot of money to get those units into your army. And the thing is, with the Vampire Counts, it's usually better to just spam out low-tier trash and rely way more on your lords and heroes than to focus on having doom stacks with them. So as far as their unit roster is concerned, I'm putting it at C tier, because you basically can ignore them at some point because their lords and heroes just outshine them by so much. And when comparing the Vampire Counts units to other factions, in a fair fight, they're just not really that good. You know, a lot of their units have pretty low combat stats, fairly low leadership. They're not particularly quick, especially in the early stages of the campaign. But that being said as well, they're able to get to their late stage units very quickly. And of course, if you do get one of their units wiped out, they do have a chance of just coming back from the dead. So that is some of the stuff that stopped it from actually getting D tier. I do think that the vampire accounts have one of the overall weakest rosters in the game because they've got just a lot of crap units in their army. That being said, they've got a lot of fantastic units as well. But when you compare it to dwarves, for example, the dwarves just don't have any bad units whatsoever. Like, none of their units are bad. If you're good at using the dwarves, you can use every single one of their units. Their worst unit is literally the miners, and that's just because it's just the worst of it, because everything else is better than them. But even the miners have a lot of armor, which can be quite good at holding lines. In fact, miners for dwarfs have more armor and more leadership than some of the tier 2 or 3 units in some of the other rosters here. Okay, so then we move on to the Greenskins. Now, this is definitely going to be a controversial one. I think a lot of people are going to disagree with it, but this is my personal opinion, and this is where I'm going to place them. Greenskins are a D tier unit roster. In my opinion, they're one of the worst rosters in the game. Their early game units are just fucking trash. Absolute rubbish. You've only really got access to goblins, and the earliest sort of access that you get that's decent units are kind of like nasty skulkers. And even then, those are units that require a fair amount of effort in order to use. Now, the Greenskins themselves are a very powerful race. I'm not saying that they're not, because they build up their momentum. You win a couple of battles, you can call a war that allows you to basically just double your army strength. Because when it comes down to it, most cases they're going up against rosters, especially like if you take Gorbad Ironclaw, where you're going to be going up against dwarfs. And most of the units that you recruit in the early stage of the campaign are just not going to be able to compete with the dwarves on a one-on-one fight, especially on the higher difficulties. And you're basically going to require to use your campaign gimmicks in order to give yourself even a fighting chance. You know, they do have a decent economy, and they can get built up to tier 5 reasonably quickly, and you can potentially get a lot of global recruit slots. But that being said, even their best units are either really bloody expensive or just not really worth it. It's kind of better to just swarm with sort of mid-tierish units in a lot of cases, or use the legendary lord's gimmicks, such as Wurzag using a lot of savage orcs just because he gives them so much physical resistance. But I think overall, because the orcs and goblins have so many just awful units that just don't trade very well against most factions, is why I'm putting them at D tier. But like I said, they're able to absolutely dominate on the campaign map due to all of their campaign mechanics. Things like scrap, things like wars are able to give them an edge. Their lords and heroes are something that you absolutely need to lean on if you want to do well in a Greenskin campaign. Whereas with the dwarfs, like, their heroes and lords are good, but you don't need to rely on them very heavily at all if you don't want to. Okay, so then we move on to Bretonnia. So Bretonnia's unit roster I'm going to put at C tier. I don't think it's quite as bad as the Greenskins, but they are pretty bad because pretty much every single melee infantry that the Bretonnians have is a complete waste because they will win against nothing, especially on the higher battle difficulties if you choose to play on that. So I usually, to get really good results, just don't even recruit the vast majority of their units because they're such rubbish. So basically all of their melee infantry I just don't recruit. Their archers are pretty good, and the thing is they don't recruit any units from their base building. They have to require a one of their optional build slots in order to have a secondary unit, in order to be able to recruit something. But the thing is, they get their archers from their farming building, which is usually the optimal building to build, so it's fine. It's not that big of a deal since it has a dual purpose to it anyway. Their early game archers are pretty good, and you have to sort of struggle a little bit in the early stage of the campaign, relying heavily on the units that you got to begin with, because the units that you recruit is crap, plus you've got limitations based on your peasant limit, and getting to your actual good units, the knights, you don't have access to them in the early stage of the campaign. So in pretty much every case for Bretonnia, you actually can't really get more than one full stack. In fact, with most cases with Bretonnia, the optimal way to go about it is to recruit 3 satellite lords to accompany your primary lord, just so that you don't go over your peasant limit. Unless, of course, you're fine with basically wrecking your economy in the early stages of the campaign, which will set you down bad path in the long term. So overall, I think that their roster is pretty damn bad, but they've got some absolutely amazing units in the late stages of the campaign, and also because they don't have supply lines in the later stages of the campaign, that's really where Bretonnia absolutely shines, and they're able to catch up. But their early game is utter rubbish. Their mid game is kind of mid. Okay, so then we move on to the Warriors of Chaos. Warriors of Chaos are S tier because they just have a tool for every situation. They recruit their units instantly. Their units can be upgraded without having to be like disbanded. They're able to use the warband system. So if you're recruiting a bunch of marauders in the early stage of the campaign, cool, keep them. And then when they get enough experience, then they become Chaos Warriors. Then you might want to turn them into a monogod faction thing. And you can turn your Chaos Warriors or whatever units into a cavalry unit if you want, and then move them up to a knight. So you've got a lot of flexibility with these units. You've also got the Gifts of Chaos, just giving you access to a tool for basically any situation. And a lot of the Warriors of Chaos units are really bloody strong, and you don't rely at all on leveling up your main settlement in order to get your highest tier units. Basically, the more you fight, the faster you'll get to your best units. But the biggest weakness of the Warriors of Chaos faction is that if you ever lose these units, it's kind of painful to get them back because you have to go through that process again. Whereas, for example, if you were playing as the Empire and you were 60 turns into it and you had an army that had some Hellstorm rocket batteries in it and then they got wiped out, well, then you could just start recruiting some new ones again. Whereas if you had a bunch of Chosen in your army, well, then you've got to go back and either get Marauders or Chaos Warriors and then level them all the way back up again to get them back to being Chosen, because Chosen will not be available anywhere, although Aspiring Champions are. And so you've got access to essentially a tier 5 unit available in most cases in your starting regions, but just that you'll have a limit to how many they can get. And the Warriors of Chaos economy, at the very first few turns, is not very good, but then snowballs way out of control as soon as you get access to maybe 2 or 3 Dark Fortresses. The Warriors of Chaos, they've got super good heroes and lords, but you don't have to rely on them as a crutch. Your roster is super bloody strong because the availability of units is so vast in terms of just how they go about their recruitment. Super strong bloody faction in terms of their roster. You've just got so many tools at their disposal because they've got one of the largest rosters in the entire game, and you've got a tool for every situation. Now, next up, Beastmen. So here's the thing about Beastmen. Beastmen have got really bloody good units, but due to the dread system, you have to spend a lot of dread to unlock additional unit capacities. And because it's a lot easier and more optimal to actually increase the number of armies that you have, as opposed to the number of available good units, it's actually way more optimal for the Beastmen to spam their earliest game units until they've got you just basically use their campaign gimmicks of being able to stalk and ambush stance, essentially, and smash them without them being seen. Their earliest best game unit, I think, is the Ungor Raiders and maybe some Chaos Warhounds for speed to run enemy units down. But yeah, I wouldn't be recruiting their Ungor Spears. They're absolutely rubbish. Some people, of course, are happy to spend the dread on getting a Jabberslith early on, for sure. There's no problem with that whatsoever. But yeah, actually getting loads of them out, they will start to... It takes a long time for the Beastmen to be able to provide all of their armies with decent units. Now, the Beastmen themselves are one of the most powerful factions in the game. Without a doubt, in my opinion. Maybe the second most powerful. But it's not because of their unit roster or the way that they recruit their units. And because of that, I'm putting them in D tier in terms of their unit roster. Because whenever I play Beastmen, I always do really well. But it's not because of their roster. It's because I'm ambushing them because of the stalk stance, or it's because their legendary lords are really friggin' powerful and they're able to absolutely pump out their armies really quickly. But those armies will be filled with trash, basically. So that's why I'm putting in D tier. Now again, it's not because they've got bad units. It's because the availability of those really good units is difficult to get a lot of compared to these other races. Every single one of these other races here will be able to pump out better units and more of them quicker than the Beastmen, even if you're really good at them. Because if you're good at the Beastmen, you won't be spending your dread on those units. You'll be spending on all the other upgrades first, because that is a better return on your investment. And that's largely just a problem of one resource, being dread, having to have so many different options for spending it. And it's just difficult to get a lot of it in order to get those unit caps. But yeah, if you were able to get the unit caps quicker, or it was cheaper to purchase those units, then I would rank this significantly higher. Again, really good units, just locked behind a fairly slow mechanic for them. Okay, then we've got the Wood Elves. So I'm going to put the Wood Elves at A tier. Just about every single unit in the Wood Elf roster is really bloody strong. If you've ever gone up against the Wood Elves, you probably know them as one of the most painful factions in the game to go and deal with. And even though they've got access to very powerful lords and heroes, their units themselves are also incredibly dangerous. They're either stalking, so you can't bloody see them till the last minute. They're usually in looser formations, making it hard to hit them in artillery. They're hard hitting. It's easy for them to just pump out units. They've got very strong economies. Difficult to face up against the Wood Elves at pretty much any stage of the campaign. Even in the early stages, when you're recruiting like Dryads or Glade Guard, these are some of the best early game units in the entire game. And they've got a lot of campaign mechanics to boost them, but just not taking that into consideration, their roster is incredibly reliable all the way through. They got good early game units, mid game units, and late. They've got some of the best late game units in the entire game. Like for example, Tree Men or their Forest Dragons, really quite affordable. And because they've got access to life magic, you can get so much value out of them, especially with the Tree Men. So that's why I'm putting them in A tier. But I just do think that these two here have got a bit more of an advantage because they can get to their higher tier units a bit faster than the Wood Elves. The Wood Elves' growth rate is a little bit slower because of how long it takes them to actually build up their main tree settlements. Okay, then we move on to Norsca. Norsca's a bit of a weird case because they're definitely not a popular faction, and they have been at one point during Total War Warhammer 2 specifically, the weakest faction in the entire game. But when we look at them right now, they're actually quite strong, and they don't really have that many weak units, and they've got actually a really good economy to support them, and they can actually get their highest tier units very quickly, but they also don't need to rely on them. So I'm actually going to put the Norscan roster at A tier as well. But you're going to have to hear me out with this, okay? I'm going to need to explain this a fair bit. Okay, so for one thing, if you're playing as Wulfric, getting access to the Marauders, you can get that basically straight away. Their best Marauder unit is tier 3. It doesn't take that long to get to those units. He's got the faction themselves has lots of boosts to help those factions out. You could also say those are faction gimmicks, I suppose. But being able to pump out loads and loads of Marauders is quite easy. And the enemies that you're going up against, like for example the Empire, they're actually really bad in the early stages of the campaign at dealing with Marauder spams. And because their economy is just so much better now, you can usually outnumber them by just pumping out basic Marauders. And like I said, it's very quick to get Marauder champions. Now, if you're playing as Throg, for example, because both of these guys play very differently, getting access to the monster units takes a little bit longer than the Marauders. But that's fine. You can still use the Marauders in the early stage of the campaign. They're fine. But although Throg does have to deal with Malachi McCason, but Malachi also has a lot of other enemies as well. But once you start getting access to the Trolls, then you just absolutely start steamrolling because it's so good for that particular faction. When you get into the later stages of the campaign, so the Trolls are a mid-tier unit. Once you get to the late stage units, the Mammoths are some of the best monster units in the entire game. So Norsca has got some really bloody good units. They've got some kind of mediocre units in terms of their missile units, but you just sort of don't lean into their weaknesses that much. Thing is with their missile units is that they're short range, so if you're going up against the Empire, it's not particularly good against them because their longer range units will just kill you before you get to them. And their missile units are better against like big monsters, which if you're going up against the Empire, they're not bringing big monsters against you. That being said, there will be points in the campaign where you go up against big monsters, and it's good to have those kind of units to help out. But overall, I think that the Norscan unit roster is actually quite robust. It's pretty quick to get access to all of their units, and their economy is easily able to sustain now a lot of armies. especially if you get the boosts through dedicating tribute to the gods, getting the boost to port settlements. Getting a lot of port settlements with Norsca will easily feed your armies. Okay, then we move on to the High Elves. Now, in my opinion, the High Elves have probably the best unit roster in the entire game. So I'm going to put them at S tier. Now, I'm going to put them at the front here. But usually, whenever I put anything in S tier, it's all basically the same. I'm not going to rank them particularly within the S tier, but I want to make a distinction for the High Elves. I think that the High Elves have the best unit roster in the entire game. Because even though their legendary lords are very powerful, they have, in my opinion, the best tier 0 recruitment in the entire game. Having access to spearmen, which the High Elf spearmen are so much better than Empire spearmen. It's not even funny. And their archers that they can recruit, which is usually what's the optimal way to go with them, spam out their archers, don't require an additional military building. And they have 180 range as a baseline, which is better than Glade Guard. These are units that you can rely on all the way up to the mid game and still do absolutely well. The High Elves are still a super rich faction and can grow very quickly. So getting them into their mid stage of the campaign, getting access to things like Lothern Sea Guard, various other mid tier sort of monsters, not really that difficult for them. And then even getting to the late stage of the campaign, they've got a super robust economy, even though they've lost the entrepreneur hero. I mean, the entrepreneur still exists. It just might as well not exist because it's so rubbish now. They're not as rich as they used to be, but their roster has got a tool for every situation. They've got access to really good infantry, really good cavalry, really good monsters. They've got amazing heroes and lords, but we're not taking that into consideration. The only thing I think they've got kind of a weakness in is their artillery, in having only one unit of artillery, being the Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower. Thing is, though, the Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower is actually one of the best anti-infantry blob destroyers in the entire game. It's really bloody good. So it's just it's good in one particular situation. So it's good to make sure that you're just not spamming out Eagle Claw Bolt Throwers. I don't think anyone's stupid enough to do that, though. Having just a couple of them in your army, in your archer-based army, is perfectly fine. But yeah, they've got tools for every situation. You want to have a melee infantry-based army? They can do that. You want to have an archer-based army? You can do it. Cavalry-based army? They've got it. Chariots? They've got it. They've got missile chariots. They've got flying monsters. They've got everything. They've got big dragons. They've got the best dragons in the game. You got access to life magic so you can heal them. And you've got access to phoenixes as well. So good sort of smaller flying units that are really bloody powerful, and you can boost them by so much. So that's why the High Elves are going in S tier. Like, super good in the early game, super good in the mid game, super good in the late game. They've just got everything that you need to destroy your enemy just on their own without requiring lords and heroes. I often find that the High Elves are able to get very good heroic victories without requiring any campaign gimmicks or anything like that. Okay, so Dark Elves. I think the Dark Elves have a really good roster, and the way that they recruit is very different to the High Elves because their primary recruitment should come from Black Arcs. And Black Arcs can grow really bloody quickly, especially in Warhammer 3. Like, it used to take a little bit longer in Warhammer 2 because it would just have a higher growth requirement. And you can usually recruit a lot of these units that are super good, such as Shades, at like tier 1 or 2 or 3. Just really early on, you've got access to some of their best units, and you can recruit them very early on at like rank 9. You can put them in their Black Arcs themselves, or recruit them from a fairly long distance, even in enemy territory, into an army. And they usually have like an absolute ton of recruitment capacity. So if you're taking shitloads of casualties in each battle and you're just losing units, having a Black Arc nearby, being able to just supply them with huge amounts of reinforcements is really good for the Dark Elves. And that's why I'm also going to be putting the Dark Elves at S tier. They also have tools for every situation. They've got amazing archers, although the strength of their archers is armor piercing, not so much range, unless of course you have a lot of lord boosting, such as the Shadow Dart Name of Power, and also complete their technology that gives them extra range. But before you've done that, they are outranged easily by the High Elves, but their armor piercing is unmatched with their missile units. They've got really good melee infantry. They've got very quick melee infantry as well. Okay cavalry. I'm not a big fan of Cold One Knights, but they are better than they used to be. They also have access to amazing monsters as well, but they don't have access to the Law of Life, so they can't really boost them by that much, which is why I'm just putting them slightly behind the High Elves there. So let's now move on to the Skaven. Now I think this is one that will also people are going to be surprised with, because I've always said how much I like the Skaven. I think they're one of the most powerful factions in the game. But their roster is shit. It's going into C tier. Because the thing is with the Skaven is that in order to be good with Skaven, you don't really rely too heavily on their roster. You rely on all their ridiculous gimmicks. They are able to get to tier 5 super bloody quickly, which, you know what, I'm going to put them at B tier because they're able to do it. They're able to get to tier 5 really quickly, but their economies are not super good. So getting the actual buildings built up so you get their really good units can take a little while just because you got to get access to the money. Their income from taxes isn't amazing, so you need to constantly be fighting enemies. It's not a problem for them, but on their own, their units, especially in the early stage of the campaign, are absolute rubbish. So having access to Skaven slave units, these are meat shields at best, and that just typically speaking are best used as distractions so that your other sneakier units can do their job. The Skaven rely super heavily on their heroes and lords. Without their heroes and lords, the Skaven roster falls apart. Even units such as Rattling Guns, Jezzails, Plagueclaw Catapults, the reason why they are so good is because of all the different ways that a hero can boost them, which is why in my armies you usually see like 2 Warlock Engineers with each of them. But that being said, they do have quite a few units that don't really require much support in order to be really good, such as their really late game Molder monsters, such as Brood Horrors, to a lesser extent, I think the Hell Pit Abominations. I'm not a super big fan of them just because their size kind of weighs them down, whereas the Brood Horrors are quick and they're smaller, so they're harder to hit in melee and also harder to shoot. But they've got a lot of tools at their disposal, but they've also just got a lot of really shit units as well. A lot of units with really low leadership, and because of the way their food works, if you're low in food, it's going to affect their leadership even further. So it can be a double-edged sword with them. So the Skaven themselves, very powerful race. One of the most powerful races on the battlefield, but it's largely because of their ability to ambush attack, not how scary their actual units are. And they rely on, of course, overwhelming numbers when the AI is at least playing as them, to overcome their situations. Because otherwise, if it's a fair fight with the Skaven, in most cases it's fine. Like, one of the most annoying things with dealing with Skaven is the fact they have Menace Below, which is an army ability. It's not the fact that clan rats are good, but being able to just port a clan rat right underneath the enemy and just get rid of their artillery, well, that's like an army ability. It's not about their roster. That's why I didn't rank it higher. They do have some really good units, but they've also got some really friggin' awful units. Like, Storm Vermin are some of the worst tier 3 units, melee infantry, in the entire game. They're fucking rubbish. So yeah, they're that's why I put them at B tier. Almost put them at C tier. Okay, then as for the Lizardmen have a really robust roster, but they can take quite a while to get things going, and it can be quite expensive. But they've got some of the best units in the entire game. So I'm going to put them at A tier, and what stops them from getting up to S tier is just the expense of getting them to that point. You know, you're not able to just spam out feral carnosaurs straight away, although you can of course do a Rite of Primeval Glory, but again that is a campaign gimmick rather than actually using their recruitment roster. But all of the Lizardmen factions are able to make use of it. Thing is, if in the early stages of the campaign you just don't buy anything and you save up 12 grand, you do a Rite of Primeval Glory army, is your economy even going to be able to sustain it? Because these are very expensive units. The Lizardmen early game economy is, in most cases, not particularly robust. They need a fair bit of territory to really get things going. And when it comes to Lizardmen as well, a lot of their strength is actually in their super bloody powerful legendary lords and their campaign mechanics. For example, Tehenowin's campaign mechanic is super good because he's able to reduce the upkeep cost of armies using followers, but also reduce the construction costs globally, using his sacrifices, which means he can pump more into recruitment compared to the other ones. They've got some very powerful campaign mechanics, especially like Nakai as well, his hoarding and the various things that he can do with his tech tree and sacrifices with the blessing of Itzel or whatever. Very, very, very powerful. But their roster themselves, super strong, like got so many really good units. It just, the expense of it and how long it takes to get there is what stops them from being S tier. These factions here will reach their best units before the Lizardmen on average. Okay, so then we move on to the Vampire Coast. Now, the Vampire Coast has got a really good unit, the Necrofex Colossus. And they've got other really good units, but the Necrofex Colossus is like their standout unit. That being said, when it comes to the Vampire Coast, the vast majority of their units are fucking terrible. So I'm going to put the Vampire Coast at C tier, because most of their early game units just are not very good. You have to rely incredibly heavily on their lords and heroes. Without them, the units just don't perform particularly well. They need very good lined up sights for their guns, so they can be quite unreliable. They're, for the most part in the early stage of the campaign, absolutely useless in melee. So if anything particularly quick comes at you, you're going to be in serious trouble. They do have access to some really good artillery in terms of their mortars and their carronades. In fact, their cannons, I think, are better than the Empire's cannons. Don't know if they're necessarily better than the Dwarf cannons because they're just so accurate, but I do think they fire better, like faster, and they hit harder than the Empire's cannons. I'm not a big fan of the Empire cannons. I'm just not sure what it is. They just don't seem to dish out as much damage as what I would expect it to. But yeah, they do have some really good units. It's just that they got a lot of shit units, that's all. And their overall economy, it's all right. It's all right. It's just not really on par with the rest of these guys here. I do feel like the Vampire Coast, being sort of not really updated since fairly early on in Warhammer 2, they've fallen behind a fair bit. But you can absolutely make a super powerful Doomstack with them, just like anyone else in this game. Largely relying on you using your shipbuilding in order to get access to Necrofex Colossus fairly quickly, if it is that you want to do that. But it's entirely optional, you don't have to do that. But yeah, I just don't think their roster is particularly robust. They've got a lot of really weak units. That being said, they also do have access to Raise the Dead. I just think that the Vampire accounts, which, don't forget, Vampire accounts are at C tier as well. I think the Vampire accounts are better when it comes to Raise the Dead. They got better use of it. Okay, then we talk about the Tomb Kings. Tomb Kings, their roster is S tier. I'm just kidding, it's D tier. Fucking trash. Just trash. All around trash with the Tomb Kings. Now, I don't think the Tomb Kings are a weak race. No, actually. I'd actually go so far as to say they're probably the weakest race in the game. I'm just going to contradict myself there. Because they just haven't been updated in a really long time. And everyone else is able to get momentum a lot quicker. Here's the problem with the Tomb Kings units. It's not that they don't have access to really good units. Like their Kemrian War Sphinx, their Tomb Scorpion, the Hyro Titan, the Necro Sphinx. These are all really good units. Good luck getting a bunch of them out. It's just going to take you ages before you're going to get a decent number of them. And in the early stage of the campaign, you're kind of forced, in many ways similar to the Beastmen, to recruit a lot of trash. But the thing is, the difference between the Beastmen and the Tomb Kings is that the Beastmen can pump out armies like fucking crazy, really bloody early on, whereas the Tomb Kings can't. They really need to get their technologies in order. It's going to take them a lot longer. And they don't have access to ambush attack, and their overall economy and how they develop is way slower than the Beastmen. So if I was to compare these two in terms of which is the stronger race, because the Beastmen kind of borrowed similar mechanics from the Tomb Kings when they got their update, the Beastmen overall, as a race, they're S tier compared to the Tomb Kings. But in terms of their roster, they're both in the D tier, because they both suffer from the same problem. Their best units take too long and are too expensive to get enough of them into the army. You have to rely too heavily on trash that you have to constantly replace with more trash, because you got to get those unit caps up and it just takes a while. And yeah, even their Tomb Guard, which Tomb Guard are about on par with Storm Vermin, but having them be free of upkeep, that's definitely an advantage. It's just that the Tomb King economy, basically all that money has to go into just constructing their actual unit capacity, and getting things really moving with the Tomb Kings. It's not great. You can't rely that heavily on their unit roster. You need to use all of their other things, such as their powerful legendary lords and canopic jars, to really sort of boost things along as quickly as you can, because their unit roster is just their best units take too long to get a decent number of them in order to rely on them too heavily. Okay, so then let's move on to the demons. So this is game 3 races now. Now, when it comes to Daniel the Demon Prince, this guy's got access to all of the demons from all of the other monogod races. So you'd think maybe that he'd be S tier. But got to keep in mind is that the faction functions differently from the other factions. Just because it has variety doesn't necessarily make it stronger. There's a lot that actually holds back the Demon Prince compared to a lot of these guys here in terms of their unit roster, and that's largely due to their economy. The Demon Prince early game is just, his economy is absolutely horrendous, and his early game options are not very good. You don't have access to particularly good demonic units in the early game, and that means that you'll probably have a fairly slow start unless you are really bloody good at using the Lord himself, which is not going to be rated on this because, like I said, we're not rating their lords and heroes here. They do have access to incredibly powerful armies that you can rely on in the late stages of the campaign, but getting to that point does take a fair bit of time. So with the Daniel the Demon Prince, his faction, I'm going to be putting him in B tier just because he suffers so much in the early stages of the campaign, but really shines in the late stages of the campaign, much in the same way as the Empire. But it's very rare to see the Daniel the Demon Prince faction be like a better conqueror using their units on their own than these factions here. But they will probably outshine these ones here, especially in the late stages of the campaign. Okay, then we've got Tzeentch. So Tzeentch has got so many campaign gimmicks that you basically, in many cases, don't even really need to have recruit units. Except if you're playing Kairos, you can't have to because his position is absolutely horrendous. It's very, very difficult. Unless you're really good at it and you've got like a guide and exactly what you want to be doing. But that being said as well, the Tzeentch roster is pretty robust. They don't really have many bad units. When it comes to their demonic units, the blue horrors and the pink horrors, they're very useful and they can cut way above their pay grade while also being quite challenging to use, because if you get too many of them, because they're in loose formation, they take up a lot of space. So if you're in a choke point situation, you might find yourself a bit too congested to use them. They're also absolutely awful in melee. But that being said, Tzeentch relies super heavily on their magic, their heroes, and all of the bloody cheat codes that they essentially get through changing of the ways. So you don't really rely too heavily on their unit roster. But they do have some really good units. Their Lords of Change, once they've got all the technology sorted, are amazing. The Mutalith Vortex Beast is absolutely fantastic. But the rest of their roster is just kind of, it's just not the shining example within Tzeentch. So I'm going to put Tzeentch at B tier in terms of their unit roster. In the early game, it's okay. In the mid game, it's okay. And in the late game, they've got super good units, but their economy kind of lets them down because they've got a really sort of basic economy. You need a lot of territory in order to afford a super good army. That being said, you could just get some really good heroes and use unlimited winds of magic or something. Okay, so then we move on to Khorne. Now, Khorne, in my opinion, is the strongest race in the game, but not necessarily because of its unit roster. Much in the same way like the Beastmen here. But they're not going down to D tier. Because the thing is with Khorne is they can grow very bloody quickly because they've got access to a technology that allows them to get extra growth for just fighting a battle. And you're going to want to fight battles constantly. And so just leaning into your own advantages there. The bloodletting mechanic is very good. So allowing you to get more momentum. And there's the things that you can do with skulls, also incredibly powerful. Now, these are campaign gimmicks, the things that you can use to boost yourself in battle, especially the summoning from beyond. That being said as well, the Khorne roster in the early stage of the campaign, you've got access to Chaos Warriors and Bloodletters right from the get-go, which are some of the best melee infantry in the entire game. So in the early game, Khorne is largely limited based on finances, not based on strength. Super fucking good units. And the thing is, if you're aggressive with Khorne, and you know what I think with Khorne? They're actually better on higher difficulties than they are on lower difficulties, because on higher difficulties, you're going to be facing bigger armies, which means you're going to be getting more loot, which means you can afford more armies, which means you can kill more units. Whereas if you play on easy difficulty, it's like you kill an army, it was only half a stack, and you're like, oh, well, I have to wait before I can really recruit that many units, so you end up having a smaller army sort of thing. So it's a bit weird with Khorne. Khorne's a very weird faction, because the tougher the enemy, the stronger you become, which is very, very much how it should be, I guess, from a lore perspective. But in terms of a total war perspective, they play nothing like the Empire. Like, Empire is very standard. These guys super bloody strong if you understand how they work. Now, early game, really, really bloody good. When it comes to their Marauders, you can basically just skip them. It's a bit weird because they require a military barracks, and the Chaos Warriors don't, and they're objectively better. They've got really good cavalry, especially in the early game as well, with their with their Marauder Horsemen having access to armor piercing very early on. Their mid-game units are also super strong. They've got access to Chosen at tier 3. That's fucking ridiculous. And their top-tier monster units are also ridiculously bloody strong. They've got access to very quick recruiting as well, as long as you get the bloodletting up, and they can be super rich. But again, a lot of that is due to their overall campaign gimmicks. So overall, in terms of their unit roster, I would actually rank it at A tier, but they are overall, which this is not a tier list for that, and they are the strongest race in the game, in my opinion, especially after the update. They got some super boosts there. But yeah, super strong units in the early, mid, and late stage of the campaign that is largely just limited based on a limited unit type, and basically it's all just melee stuff. Their range is quite limited, but they do have access to single entity monsters, really good multi-entity monsters such as Minotaurs. They've got some of the best melee infantry in the game. They've got really good lords and heroes as well, which of course we're not ranking here. But yeah, I think it's A tier. Like if it's just their units going up against these guys here, their economies and their earlier game units are just way more cost effective than the Khorne units. Like if you had the same amount of territory and spent all of your money on a single army, you would have a larger army with these guys here, and they would be able to stomp on Khorne's meager economy, basically. But that's a bit of a silly example because that wouldn't happen. But yeah, these guys here, they've just got a better economy for their units than Khorne, only slightly. Okay, and then we've got Slaanesh. So Slaanesh is kind of like the opposite of Khorne in that most of their units are shit. They're just really bloody squishy. Like the Demonettes are not a particularly good demon unit just because of how squishy they are. Very quick, so that's useful. So it requires a fair bit of micromanagement, which also means that they have to replace their units fairly often if you're not careful. Their economy is probably, it depends on how you look at it. Their taxing economy is better than Khorne, but Khorne's looting economy is vastly better than Slaanesh. Slaanesh's real strength comes from their disciples. Being able to pump out disciple armies, especially in the late stage of the campaign, is what makes Slaanesh really good in the late stage. But in the early game, it definitely struggles because they don't have the economy to really keep up with the High Elves, because that's what you're going up against with playing as Nakari. And you've only got access to basic Marauders, which aren't really that good against the High Elves, and also Demonettes, which again, are not particularly that great. They do have some really good cavalry and chariots, but again, they're very squishy. And their single entity monsters, such as the Keeper of Secrets, are, in my opinion, one of the weaker, greater demons compared to the other ones. Lords of Change and Bloodthirsters, I think, are a cut above the other two. Thing is, with the Great Unclean Ones, it's just that they're super tanky. They're just really vulnerable. We haven't got to them yet, but they've at least got better law of magic than the Slaanesh one. So I'm going to put Slaanesh, their roster, at B tier alongside Tzeentch. It's definitely a competent unit roster. It's just that it requires a lot of micromanagement because you're relying very heavily on speed. A lot of people, I think, struggle with Slaanesh a fair bit. A lot of people dominate with Slaanesh, so it's a bit of a double-edged sword there with them. Okay, so Nurgle. Another thing to keep in mind with Slaanesh is that they have yet to have their, rework and their DLC. So it's quite possible 6 months from now they might be on the same tier as Khorne, or maybe not. We'll just have to wait and see. I can't predict what the future's going to be. Even assuming that is the next DLC, which I think is a safe bet. Whatever. Okay, so Nurgle's roster. Nurgle's roster is really fucking good, and the way that they recruit is okay in the late stages of the campaign, but in the early stages, it's bad. Really friggin' bad. I would put this faction in S tier if it wasn't for how they recruit their units in the early stage. And because of how crippling it is in the early stage of the campaign, compared to the other factions, I'm actually going to put them in C tier. It's the early game that slows Nurgle down the most, and that's the reason why it's here, because even though they've got access to good early game units, because of their cyclical nature and just having availability of those units in the early game, this is a race that struggles to even build a single full stack in the first couple of turns, compared to these other races which can very easily build a full stack. And most of these guys here, you're building, especially on legendary difficulty, you're building a stack and a bit by like turn 5. Nurgle simply can't do that, even if you've got the resources, because you're stuck there fucking waiting for the damn cycle, or having to spend the infections in order to speed up the process. But their actual units themselves are really bloody good. Things like they're chosen, you can get a couple of chosen fairly early on, but they're very strong. Their Rot Knights are amazing. They've got really good bloody monsters. It's just that the time that it takes to get them is slower than these other guys here. They suffer a similar problem than the Beastmen and the Tomb Kings, but they are quicker at getting things up and running than these two by a significant margin. And I do think that overall they've got more access to better units than these guys here. I mean, Beastmen have got a ton of really good units. It just you can't spend your dread on everything. You've got to choose it carefully. Okay, now we're moving on to the ogres here. So when it comes to the ogres, these guys have a bit of a weird situation because of their latest updates in regard to their camps. Most of your recruitment will happen through camps. In the early stages of the campaign, most of the ogre factions will really struggle to get more than 1 or 2 camps going. And you have to do a fair amount of killing in order to get enough meat to level it up. But if you're competent at the game, you can do that very quickly. Now, I think that their earliest game units, things like Ogre Bulls and Noblars, things that you can recruit from essentially basic settlement buildings, are not that good beyond the first few turns. They are reasonably expensive, and they're kind of like a one-trick pony. They're okay, not fantastic. You want to phase these units out as early as you possibly can. They will rely very heavily on their lords and heroes in the early stages of the campaign, and on their various campaign gimmicks. But once you start getting towards the mid and late stage campaign, this is where the ogres go from being kind of okay to being an absolute domination force. Every access to a tier 3 pottery resource will give you access to another camp limit. As you have more camps in reserve and you've put more meat into them, you can basically have a constant daisy chain, essentially, where you pack up a camp and then move your army and then put down another camp that's already tier 5 because you've just been developing it over time. Having reserves of camps is really bloody good. And to get to that point, you just need a lot of meat and you need a lot of time to build those up. And you get access to constant recruitment, basically attrition immunity, huge boosts to the loot. But this is based on their camp mechanic, not necessarily their unit roster. That being said, their unit roster, like I said, kind of lousy in the early stages with the basic Noblars and the basic Ogre Bull monstrous infantry units. But then you start getting access to the Iron Blaster artillery. People seem to really love the lead belchers. Those are really good units for sure. But where they really shine, I think, is their single entity monsters, such as the Stonehorns and especially the Thunder Tusks, and their monstrous cavalry, that kind of stuff. Once you get to that point, that's where the ogres are really bloody strong, especially because as you get to the late stage of the campaign and they rely heavily on their loot economy, the enemy forces that start coming at you will be stronger, and these armies will just be able to handle it very easily. But the ogres do rely quite heavily on their army abilities, on various gimmicks such as whatever their camp is able to provide for them, and also the gimmicks, I guess the faction mechanics of their particular legendary lord. Like, for example, Golg being able to teleport around, with Greasus being able to basically use cheat codes, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a decent roster. It's just lopsided. So I'm going to put it at B tier for having a weak early game, but a really friggin' strong late game. Like, you can rely very heavily on the late game units with the Ogre Kingdoms because they've got so many really good ones. There's loads of different doom stacks you can make with the Ogre Kingdoms. But I don't think they're worthy of these guys here, just because I think they get their shit up and running way quicker than these guys. Okay, then we've got Kislev here. So Kislev has got a really robust roster. They don't have that many bad units, and they've got a lot of especially good units that are very heavily boosted by lords and heroes, which again we don't want to take too much into consideration. But Kislev is a very strong faction, especially in the early stages of the campaign. Kossars are really bloody good hybrid unit. They're quite cheap. They only require the settlement building, so good tier 0 capabilities. Not particularly fantastic range, but their replaceability, like the cheapness of them, and also the various boosts that you can give them, like through the tech tree. Kossars are very useful all the way through the campaign, at least to the mid stage of the campaign. Where they start to fail a little bit is because their early game economy isn't so good, but their late stage economy is absolutely fantastic because they've got a bunch of small little global bonuses that they get every single time they get access to a new, or just any trade resource, even if they've already got access to it. It's about the trade resource building, providing a small global bonus. It really adds up in the late stages. They've got some really amazing late game units, such as Ice Guard, and I actually think that their sleds are some of the best units in the game, but you gotta know how to use them. They're not something that you would be able to rely heavily on auto resolve, and if you don't do a lot of micromanagement with them, then they can fail on you very quickly. It's just that I like them a lot because I can make them essentially free of upkeep thanks to various hero traits. Their little Grom artillery is especially good, but one of the big things that make Kislev particularly good is all the things that they can do to reduce global recruitment times. So you can essentially globally recruit any of their units in one turn because they've just got, if you've especially got access to Prague, there's a building landmark there that reduces global recruit time by like 2 turns. And then there's another technology reducing it by additional turn. So you can get your armies up and running super bloody quickly. So they're very good in the late stage of the campaign, and they're pretty solid in the early game. And I think it's kind of the middle where the unit roster is kind of a little bit lousy, just a little bit. It's a bit weird, these guys having access to essentially chaos units with the things in the wood and the incarnate elemental of beasts. But you know, those are really good units. So I'm going to be putting Kislev at A tier, because I think their roster is something you actually have to lean very heavily into to rely on. You can't rely that heavily on their lords and heroes or their campaign gimmicks, because I don't think their campaign gimmicks, except for Astankia, are particularly strong. But their roster is very reliable, especially because they've got By Our Blood, so that they'll fight to the death at least for 30 seconds before they rout. Another thing as well, if you've got the DLC, the Kislevite warriors, having access to an anti-large and armor-piercing unit at a tier 0, as in just with the settlement building, super bloody good for them. So yeah, I'm going to put them at A tier. I think that the Kislevite roster, in my opinion, is stronger than the Empire roster. Even if it doesn't have like the Hellstorm rocket batteries and the artillery, they make up for it with their single entity monsters, and in my opinion, their cavalry is better than the Empire's. Okay, so now we move on to Cathay. Cathay's super early stuff, peasants, is not amazing. But the thing is, this is one of the rare cases where they've got access to fantastic units at tier 1 with Jade Warriors. Like, the leap in quality between a Peasant Longspear and a Jade Warrior is astounding. So it's really worth it to have access to a military building early on, unlike with Reichland, because the quality jump between having a Spearman without shields to Swordsman with shields is negligible. But Jade Warriors is a huge difference. Jade Warrior Crossbowmen as well, getting access to them at tier 2. So you've got some really bloody good infantry available very early on. And you basically use the peasant units as sort of like the global recruitment unit, because you'll very early on get access to them being able to recruit in one turn. So I think that the Cathay unit roster is pretty damn good. I wouldn't put it at S tier. I would put it about on par with the Kislevites, because they've got Jade Warriors is definitely sort of like the way to go. They've got a decent economy, very good with their trade. As long as your caravans aren't getting destroyed, you'll make a decent amount of money through that. When they get to their mid-game, it's okay-ish units, and then their late-stage units are fantastic, especially with their infantry and their artillery. So the Dragon, Celestial Dragon Guard, really good, and the Celestial Dragon Crossbowmen, amazing bloody units. And they've also got very good single-entity units, such as like the Moonbird, the Terracotta Sentinels. There's a lot working in Cathay's favor, so that's why I'm putting them in A tier. And it doesn't take them very long to get leveled up, and with their settlements, and their economy is able to support it quite easily. It's not difficult with Cathay, especially with Yuan Bo, to easily pump out multiple armies very early on in the campaign, which you kind of need to do because you've got a lot of enemies. Same thing with Kislev, I guess. Then we move on to the Chaos Dwarfs. Now, Chaos Dwarfs, once again, like these guys here, suffer from army caps. But the thing is, they have one dedicated resource for increasing their army caps, which is the armaments. It's with the Beastmen, for example, you need to accumulate dread, but dread is spent on loads of other things as well, such as some upgrading your max potential for your herdstones, or unlocking global benefits for newly recruited herds that you recruit, and also increasing your army caps. All of that stuff takes priority, in my opinion, over the unit caps. When it comes to the Chaos Dwarves, it's their armaments. Getting early armaments is a little bit tricky, so getting the early game unit caps for like some good Chaos Dwarf units, you're not going to be pumping out a full stack of Chaos Dwarf units super early on. But as their campaign progresses, they progress a lot quicker than these two guys here in accumulating those resources, especially with the armament side of things. So you're not going to get that many Chaos Dwarf units early, but once you get to about the mid stage of the campaign, you're really starting to pump them out. And they've got some truly amazing things you can do with their units, and something that you can rely on very heavily. That being said as well, in the early stages of the campaign, when you're relying on hobgoblins, they're not too bad either. It's just that you need to get a lot of them, but they're easily available, especially if you get access to Gordar's Backstabber. So it's not that big of a deal to have maybe 1 or 2 armies of hobgoblins in the early stage of the game, and because they don't have supply lines, you don't have to disband them, and then just pump out your core Chaos Dwarf units later down the track. I think it'll happen, basically between turn 40 to 60 is where you really start to pump those units out. It can potentially take them a little while to get to tier 5 if you spread your Conclave influence out sort of evenly, or you could just save up a bunch and basically play it the Skaven way and just go straight to tier 5. So you can get access to your best units super early on, just like the Skaven can. So this is a faction that, depending on how you play it, depends on how early you're going to get your best units. And these are some really friggin' fantastic units. So as for the Chaos Dwarf roster, I'm going to put it at A tier as well, because they can... They're limited based on their unit capacity. It's just that they're less limited, I think, than these guys here. And you can rely quite heavily on the hobgoblins until you reach that point. And once you do get access to like the Chaos Dwarf units, then you really can rely on them. Because every single one of the Chaos Dwarf core units, the ones that you actually have to spend armaments to increase the capacity of, they're like all fantastic. Even from like the basic Chaos Dwarf infantry all the way to their monster units. Their missile units are amazing. They've got the blunderbusses. You've got the Infernal Guard Fireglaves. The regular Infernal Guard are amazing. They're single entity monsters. They're multi-entity monsters, such as the Centaur units. They're really bloody good. So their roster is strong. It's just that you can't get them going as quickly as these guys here. So that's why I put them at A tier. Almost put them at B tier if it wasn't for the fact they just have so many really good units, in my opinion. So anyway, that there is the all factions unit roster tier list there, ranking them all amongst themselves. As you can see here, I think that there are more factions than not that have solid rosters, and I think these ones here, it's not that their factions are weak, it's just that they don't rely on their unit rosters as much or as quickly as these ones here. This isn't like these factions are the best and these ones are the worst. Like Greenskins and Beastmen are objectively some of the strongest factions in the game, just not because of their unit roster. So I just want to make that distinction here. Anyway, that's the end of this one here, guys. Let me know in the comments below what you think, whether you think I'm right or wrong about any of this. Make sure that if you disagree with it, give some reasoning as to why you think a particular faction should be 1 or 2 points higher or lower. Give some reasoning as to your particular playstyle, because that really helps. If you just go in here and say, just tier list is crap, that doesn't teach me anything. So give me some explanation as to what you think about all this, because it all depends on different perspectives, different play styles. I can only take this from my own perspective. Anyway, end of this one here. Don't forget to check out Manscaped, link in the description and pinned comment. Once again, big thanks to them for supporting these videos and supporting the channel for so long. These videos here would not be coming out as frequently as they do if it wasn't for them. They would be much less frequent. Anyway, that's it this one. Appreciate you guys, and we'll see you next time. Later, guys.